Ambassador O'Sullivan, I want to begin with the refugee crisis. We saw some 1 million, more than 1 million people cross the borders and come into Europe in 2015. Do you expect this type of trend to continue this year in 2016?
Well, I don't want to make a precise prediction about numbers, but I think there is no sign that this issue is going to go away anytime soon. And by the way, I don't even think it's a question of 2016 or 2017. I think this is something which could be with us for many years to come. When you look at the large number of displaced people, about 60 million people displaced globally, I think we have to face that this is the new normal for Europe, and we are going to have to adjust and be able to deal with this. Of course, the numbers are not in themselves all that dramatic. 1 million in a Europe of 500 million people, when you look at how many there are in Turkey or in Lebanon with 25% of the population as refugees. Other countries are also struggling with even bigger numbers.
Ambassador, EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker says he feels EU's reputation was tarnished by failure of member countries to manage this refugee migrant emergency. Is he right to some extent?
Well, I think this was something which caught us by surprise, and many of our member states were faced with numbers on a daily basis which were way beyond what they were used to coping with. And therefore, I think we did have some unfortunate scenes of people forced to wait outside, people queuing up at frontiers. We had the tragedy, of course, of people dying, drowning in the Mediterranean, even if 3,000 people drowned, but we managed to rescue 122,000. So I think that the global coverage was not terribly positive, but I think when you look behind that, you do see that there was a huge amount of compassion and great humanity shown by the people of Italy, the people of Greece, people of Germany, Austria, Sweden. So I think there's also a positive story about how Europe reacted, but I would agree that we need to do better this year.
And so many of these countries you mentioned, clearly their resources drained. A number of them put up borders and fences. And I want to ask you about Denmark and what we learned this week. Lawmakers there are considering passing a law, and I should caution saying they're just considering this, that would require newly arrived refugees to hand over their valuables, Ambassador, including gold or jewelry, to help pay for the cost of lodging them. And there was another report that Switzerland, which is not an EU member, is considering similar measures. Is this the right approach?
Well, firstly, I don't know exactly what's happening in Switzerland, and as you say, the measures in Denmark are under debate. I think one important thing you have to bear in mind is that in Denmark itself, there are requirements for Danish citizens who wish to qualify for state assistance also to explain how much capital they have or assets they may have. So I think this is not necessarily a measure targeted specifically at refugees. It is designed to make sure that if people in fact have valuable assets off which they could live, that they do not then become a drain on state resources. But I fully take the point that this is not the essential message of many of these people who've gone through great hardship, come from very difficult situations, and who are fully entitled to the welcome and to be correctly treated in Europe. And I think Denmark has a very fine tradition of looking after refugees, and I'm sure they will continue that.
Are you concerned at all about any sort of backlash, anti-immigrant backlash across Europe?
Yeah, I think we have to be honest and say that there is an issue of the political sustainability of these refugee flows. I think the impression which was created very often in terms of the television screens was of a situation perhaps not fully under control. And I think that's one of the reasons why the European Commission is putting a lot of emphasis now on a better control of the external frontiers, not to shut the frontiers, not to push back the refugees, but to make sure that they are received in better circumstances and in a more structured and organized way. I think we are going to face challenges of assimilation and of integration, which we know. We've seen what happened in Cologne. And I think that's a part of the equation, is how do we make sure that these refugees who are given asylum status are integrated. President Juncker has called for them to be able to work immediately. Their bid for asylum has been accepted. And I think we will have to do a lot of work on integration and education of the migrants on the countries in which they are now living, but also work on the European public opinion to demonstrate that these migrants could actually be a source of opportunity and enrichment of the European labour market.
We've seen a number of terror attacks in almost every corner of the world. What is Europe's role in the fight against terrorism, Ambassador?
Well, first and foremost, of course, like everywhere, we want to protect our own territory, and the result of what has happened, of course, most recently in Paris, but we've had attacks elsewhere over the last 18 months or so. Paris again with Charlie Hebdo, attacks in Belgium, in Denmark. And we've had in the past attacks in Madrid and in London going back 10 years or so. So I think we need to have better intelligence sharing between our member states, because the key to counter terrorism is intelligence sharing. We're also working very closely with our allies, including the United States. And of course, we are working very closely with the international efforts to address the problems in Syria, to address the problems in Libya, which is very often where the ISIS in particular, of course, is a new source of terror threat. And we are part of, many of our member states are part of the international coalition pushing back against ISIS.
Have you ever witnessed anything like this? The power of ISIL and the terror they're waging around the world?
Well, I mean, I can't say that. I think, yes, I think we had, after 9/11, we were very frightened of Al-Qaeda. And I think we have had, I mean, in Europe, we are not strangers to terrorism. I mean, I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland in the 1960s and 70s with the IRA letting off bombs in the mainland of Britain, in Northern Ireland with bombs. I very nearly was killed myself on one occasion by a bomb going off in Dublin. So, and we've had the Red Brigades, we've had the Baader Meinhof, we've had the ETA, Basque separatists. So I think on one level, we do have to accept that terrorism can be a reality of open societies, and that it will never completely disappear. And I think that is something we have to explain to people. And the numbers who are ultimately killed are relatively small, and the chances of people being caught in a terrorist incident is far less than being caught in other forms of risky activity, like driving a car or taking a plane. So I think on one level we have to try and explain to people that this is not the sort of all-encompassing risk to people's everyday lives. On the other hand, we have to accept that it is a very real risk. We have to take preventative measures, we have to have the intelligence sharing, and we have to do everything we can to keep our people safe.
And I think one thing that may be different nowadays with ISIL is their sophisticated knowledge of social media and how they use that to recruit people. So some might argue that that is a little bit different from the days of terrorism in the 70s, 80s, and 2001 with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see that the terror threat is constantly evolving. I mean, the suicide bombing is already quite different than what we saw, as you say, in earlier times. So unfortunately, we constantly have to deal with an evolving threat. And you're absolutely right, the use of social media, the recruiting of people and grooming of them through the social media is certainly something that we need to pay close attention to. And
Ambassador, finally, I'd like to ask you about Iran, the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA. There should be an announcement soon in the next 48 hours to verify whether Iran has complied with the terms of that landmark nuclear agreement in July. What will this mean in terms of EU sanctions against Iran and the overall future relations between the European Union and Iran?
Well, if indeed we have what is called implementation day, which means that Iran has complied with all of the conditions for us to say that now we start the implementation of the agreement, the European Union will lift the sanctions which were related to the nuclear weapon issue. We will not lift the sanctions which were related to the financing of terrorism or human rights issues. Right. So that's the bargain which has been reached, and if Iran meets its side of the deal, then of course we should respect ours. In terms of the broader relationship, I think it's important to say that this deal was self-contained about the issue of nuclear weapons. It does not address a number of the other issues we have with Iran. We continue to have disagreements about Iran's role in the region, about the financing of terrorism, about human rights, and we will continue to have tough discussions with Iran on those issues. But I think many people hope that this could potentially be the turning of a page and the beginning of a new era in relations. And if the reform-minded people in Iran gain more influence, that we could eventually see an improvement in our relations. But I want to emphasize this is not guaranteed and it's not built into the deal. The deal was designed to prevent Iran from being able to obtain nuclear weapons. That is achieved if this all goes through. And that was the terms of that deal. But of course, we would always hope that then there would be the prospect, perhaps, of a better dialogue with Iran and of improved relations going forward.
Ambassador David O'Sullivan, thank you so much, sir, for your time.
Thank you very much indeed.